So with that, I want to thank Nicholas Hull, class of 1999, instructor of history at Northeastern Illinois University in Chicago, for his willingness to be a presenter in this new forum. If you have any questions for Nicholas, please submit them via the chat function and we will answer them after the presentation. And for now, our featured speaker, Nicholas Hull.
Hello. I want to start by thanking everybody for being here, particularly the multiple members of my family who claimed they were going to be here. I'm not sure if they actually made it, but I appreciate that support from them and from everybody else. I want to thank Lawrence for providing this opportunity, this forum. I think it will be very good for the university to get its name out in this way. And I think the number of people who signed up for this shows the commitment people have to the university. Two more thank yous to Mark Briesman, who I believe is on as well, who puts a lot into Bjorklund, and of course this is coming out of the Bjorklund and stuff, so I'd like to thank him. And of course I want to thank Jacqueline and Shana for their tireless efforts to make this work. This has been a smooth process and I appreciate it. So with that, I will share my screen. And then slideshow. Sorry, as a medievalist, I have trouble with technology, so we'll see how it works. So pandemics and the environment in the pre-modern world. I'm going to pretty much cover 4 pandemics today, and I'm going to spend most of the time on the Black Death because I'm pretty sure that's the one that most people are familiar with and most people would like to know more about. Pandemic and epidemics in the pre-modern world is a rising field. It's a great place. It's an amazing place to combine history, archaeology, literature, biological science, genetics, zoology, and climate science to create a more full picture of the past. And a lot of people in my field are looking for interdisciplinary approaches to the past. The story of pre-modern disease, of course, takes place within the context of environmental history because diseases are a natural phenomenon and humans are forced to deal with their role and place in nature on an everyday basis and throughout all of human existence, even beyond the written record. Also, environmental history calls for an interdisciplinary approach. It is, of course, hard to deal with environmental history without talking about climate, and we can definitely see climate how climate fluctuates throughout the entirety of human history, and it has fluctuated since before written history, because of a growing field called paleoclimatology, which includes the work being done by NOAA, which is a fascinating organization. And this is a website. I took a screenshot directly of their webpage, introductory webpage on this topic. And you can see, you can figure out climate from fauna, from coral, from lakes, from tree rings, from all kinds of really interesting things. So bringing science and history together. And we see variation over time. And I'm going to point out how that works in each of the pandemics we're going to look at. So the first one I'd like to turn to happened in ancient Greece. It happened during the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta and their allies. And the war started in about 431 or so and lasted almost to the end of the century. But the plague itself of the Peloponnesian War occurred between 430 and 429. At least that's the hardest hit. So this plague, or this disease, must be seen in the context of war and the effect of the environment. If we believe Thucydides, the great historian, he wrote that it first began, it is said, in the parts of the Ethiopia, above Egypt, and hence descended into Egypt and Libya, and into most of the country. Suddenly, upon Athens, it first attacked the population in the Pyrrhus, which is the harbor, which was the occasion of their saying that the Peloponnesians had poisoned the reservoirs, there being as yet no wells there, and afterwards appeared in the upper city, where the death became more frequent. The problem with the Peloponnesian War and plague is the strategy that Pericles, the great general, offered, which was they should build 2 walls between the city of Athens and the Piraeus, or the harbor, as you can see here, and put all the people in it so the Spartans couldn't get at them, and then wage a war of attrition. The problem is, if plague hits when you are that closely, densely shoved into what amounted to a tunnel, it's going to spread quickly. So we have to see this in terms of the war strategy, and also in terms of these sort of environmental concerns that are going on. There were heavy losses for the Athenians because of plague, and it actually kills Pericles. And when Pericles dies, although the war lasts for another 25 years, it pretty much is the end for Athens, or I would argue that it's the end for Athens. So we should keep that in mind as we look at this. We don't know exactly what caused this plague, but it sets the stage for how pre-modern Europeans would see disease and its relationship to war and the environment. When plague struck, the next major plague struck, it was in late antiquity in the late Roman Empire, and they were definitely looking back to the Greeks for models. The plagues of the late Roman Empire, it is in the context of climate and war as well. The Roman Empire of the 3rd century had almost an ideal climate. It was at the end of what is known as the late Halcyon period, which was very hospitable. The Mediterranean basin and the surrounding areas, known as the Mediterranean littoral, were warm, wet, and the weather was stable. Particularly the Nile would flood regularly, and at the time, Egypt was the breadbasket of the Roman Empire. Most of the grain in the empire came either from there or from the Black Sea. There were also no major volcanic eruptions. You may think of Vesuvius, the famous one with Pompeii and Herculaneum, but that was not nearly as bad as the sources make it out to be. According to volcanologists, none of the largest 25 eruptions in the last 2.5 millennia occurred between the death of Julius Caesar in 41 BCE and the year 169 CE. The glaciers had retreated up into the Alps, which allowed for commerce, agriculture, and technological process. At that point, population grows immensely. Not necessarily because people are producing more children, but because people are moving into the Mediterranean basin because of how good the weather is, how good the agriculture is. You get the Mediterranean diet of olives, of grapes, of wheat, of sheep, and so on and so forth. So it's a good time. But that population growth is going to lead to environmental change, particularly in the terms of disease. So in the mid 160s, pestilence arises, probably in part because of a military campaign in the east, in Persia. And this disease is going to turn out to be smallpox. The Antonine Plague, which is considered the world's first major pandemic, occurs at this time, and is highly communicable and highly lethal, which is why it gets the designation by modern historians and disease specialists of being a pandemic. There's a halt in building, there's mass graves, and literary sources bear out the unprecedented mortality. Climate becomes destabilized thereafter. In part, these changes lead to what becomes known as the late antique Little Ice Age, which will lead to the Germanic migrations and arguably the fall of the Roman Empire. Another plague hits in Alexandria in 249, in Rome in 251. It's called the Plague of Cyprian. This one is probably viral as opposed to bacterial. And most sources, it looks a lot like Ebola, so it was deadly. Between these plagues, approximately 1/3 of the Roman population died, or the population of the Roman Empire. The plague drained manpower for food production and military activity, and basically, in many scholars' ideas, led to the fall of the Roman Empire and the beginning of the Middle Ages. One thing to note here, we're looking at environmental factors, we're looking at demographic factors, and we're looking at military factors. And that's going to sort of be the general trend as we move forward. Not too long after, about 300 years later, for us medievalists, 300 years is nothing, we get the Justinianic plague. This happens mostly in Byzantium. It's centered in Constantinople. It starts during the reign of the Emperor Justinian. And this is most likely bubonic plague. The full plague runs from about 541 to 750, but it's most deadly in the 6th century. The problem is this used to be considered by historians to be a major turning point in history, but there's little evidence for demographic, economic, or cultural effects of the plague, unless you count Procopius's examples of how when the Emperor Justinian recovered from the plague, he went insane and would be seen carrying his head through the palace at midnight. The plague did reach Bavaria and Persia. By the way, Procopius is a somewhat suspect source, if you couldn't tell by the way I described it. So scholarship is moving to understand the Justinianic plague may have been more inconsequential in the formation of later Eurasia than we saw before. But again, climate adjustments with the late antique Little Ice Age, war with Persia, the emperor had increased demographic pressures with more population growth. So we're seeing these general trends being laid out in pre-modern pandemic / disease occurrences. So what does that mean? We get to probably the most intense pandemic the world has ever seen. I saw a little chart that had like the size of the virus or the bacteria in terms of how many people it killed. The Black Death had the most. And I'm going to put on a short video here to give you an idea of what the Black Death in popular culture looked like.
What? Nothing. Here's your ninepence. I'm not dead. Here. He says he's not dead. Yes, he is. I'm not. He isn't? Well, he will be soon. He's very ill. I'm getting better. No, you're not. You'll be stone dead in a moment. Oh, I can't take him like that. It's against regulation. I don't want to go on the car. Oh, don't be stuck, baby. I can't take him. I feel fine. Well, do us a favour. I can't. Well, can you hang around a couple of minutes? You won't be long. No, I've got to go to Robinson's. I've lost 9 today. Well, when's your next run? Thursday. You think I'll go for a walk? You're not fooling anyone, you know. Look, is there something you can do? I feel happy. I feel happy. Oh, thanks very much.
Well, I hope that gives you a little idea of how the plague has been seen in popular culture. Another major film was, of course, the Ingrid Bergman film where the knight comes back from the Crusades and ends up dying of plague at the end. So this has been a theme throughout popular culture. As joking as Monty Python is, they do actually get some things right in this, and you'll see that as I continue. But what is the context for the Black Death? Some of these are going to look very familiar. There was huge demographic growth between about 1000 and 1300 CE. This is in part because the climate changed. The climate actually warmed in the 10th and 11th century. This means there was an agricultural revolution. It's where we see a lot of the development of water mills. We see a lot of development of irrigation. We get the development of new farm implements that can turn more soil, rockier soil, which means food production goes up. And as I tell my students all the time, as food production goes up, population grows. You just can support more people. The thing about getting more people is that you don't need everyone to farm if you have better farm methods and you have more people. So there's a rise in urbanization. The cities grow dramatically in that 300-year period, in commercial, which leaves people to do different things. You can now have professional blacksmiths. You can now have professional weavers. You can have professional tailors. You can have professional merchants. So you get a rise in commercialization, which increases trade lines. And you can get a class of academics, which perhaps is not necessarily the world's best thing, but it happened. Anyway, because of this demographic growth, some people have postulated that what is known as a Malthusian crisis occurred. A Malthusian crisis happens, and the little graph up at the top kind of points this out. What you get is that food production grows historically, arithmetically, while population grows geometrically. What does that mean? Food production grows on a straight line, and population grows in what would look like a parabola if the graph was continued, which means there's a point where population growth outstrips food production growth. And that's that point of crisis. And Malthus, who was a 19th, 20th century economist, postulated that then the population has to fall off, which might be why we have the famine. Sorry, I'm seeing something in the chat. Oh, okay, I'll let, whoa, what happened there? Sorry, I saw the chat and I will let that be for Shayna and Jacqueline to deal with. Anyway, so what happens at the beginning of the 14th century is there's a great famine. 7 years, 5 to 10% of the Northern European population dies, weakens immune system, so when the Black Death arrives, things go badly. It weakens people. Also, there is a horrible war going on that starts in 1337. There's wars all the way up to it, but the 100 Years' War between England and France begins in the middle, or at the beginning of the second quarter of the 14th century, which means it's even harder to produce food with war horses going across land, all of this kind of stuff. So there's also religious problems with the Babylonian captivity of the church when the papacy moved to Avignon, France, which is an interesting story, but probably one better saved for another time. And then there's climate. We enter the Little Ice Age during the 13th century, which is one of the reasons why we have famine. So you'll see demographic issues between population growth and urbanization, environmental factors of climate and famine, war between the 100 Years' War. All of this destabilizes the environment of 13th and 14th century, the globe, basically. And as a result, this little character arrives on the scene. Plague is caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. It was first micrologically identified in Hong Kong in 1894. It produces what is known as the bubonic plague. Today, we can cure this with antibiotics because it is a bacterium, as opposed to the virus that causes COVID. And it has one of the highest mortality rates known to science. It manifests in 3 forms. The first is bubonic plague, which is an infection of the lymph node system. And you get these cool buboes, mostly on the lymph nodes, between the legs, on the neck. Hands become mortified. My favorite picture on this slide is, of course, the medieval manuscript where you've got all these people being attended by monks with buboes on them. We'll get back to why the monks are so important in a little bit. The lymphatic system then infects the blood, and you die basically of septicemic shock. The bacteria can also directly enter the bloodstream where the septicemic shock happens right away. Bubonic plague, where the buboes come from, has a fatality rate somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 to 90%. Also, septicemic plague, 99%. In the Middle Ages, without antibiotics, if you get a blood infection, you're probably done. The third stream is pneumonic plague, which affects the lungs. This is the only one that is airborne and the only one that can be passed human to human. So, if it can't be passed human to human, how is it passed? How is the bacteria transmitted to humans? This little guy, a flea. This particular flea has Yersinia pestis in it. The disease is the big red circle that's there. What happens is the flea takes the virus in from a host. It goes into their digestive system, blocks the digestive system. Here is a picture of the digestive system of the flea that's infected with the bacterium. It can't process the blood. So it regurgitates the blood back into the host, where it infects the host. The flea either takes in more blood from the same host or decides they can't get enough food from the original host and jumps host. The host did not start as humans. Most often, the flea, possibly a tick or possibly a louse, would attach to a rodent. And here are some rats. Rats were the most common hosts, particularly the European rat, which is known as Rattus rattus. Also, marmots are known to have it as well in the medieval world. And it would pass through the vector, which is the flea, would pass the disease through the host until the host vector system was disrupted, in which case the flea would find new hosts, which could include humans. And here you have the little rats rowing their boat off to, in theory, infect the entirety of Europe. So there's been a lot of debate up until the last 20 years as to what the Black Death was. There were people who said it couldn't possibly be Yersinia pestis. Remember, it wasn't isolated until the end of the 19th century. So we're dealing with trying to figure this all out in a historical sense. At the beginning of the 21st century, paleomicrobiologists and paleopathologists determined that Yersinia pestis was indeed the plague. There was a study in around 2000 where a French team extracted bodies from a cemetery outside of Paris. They extract the dental pulp from the teeth, and they were able to follow this, this mechanism to determine that it was Yersinia pestis. Later in 2011, we got the complete sequencing of the bacterium from a well-dated Black Death cemetery outside London. I think it's in East Stratford. What does this mean? It means we can trace the spread of the disease more accurately, both in terms of geology and chronology. And it makes our job in a way easier. We can use science to help us understand the historical problem. There are in academic circles, however, plague deniers. There should be a groan coming up from the crowd at this point. They aren't denying that the plague happened. There's no way about that. They're just denying that Yersinia pestis is the cause. They were unable to get past the historical incongruencies between the medieval and modern occurrences of the plague. So they kind of ignored the science. I know that's shocking that people ignore science, but that happened. The fact of the matter is the medieval strain and the modern strain share every single nucleotide except for 10, which I'm not a scientist, I'm not a microbiologist, but that doesn't seem like a lot to me. So I'm willing to accept the science and the reports that seem to hold water, and we'll go with the assumption that Yersinia pestis was indeed the cause of the Black Death. The next problem is we do not necessarily understand the mechanisms of spread. We know where it spread to, we know when it spread, we know that it was carried by the vector of the flea or the tick or the louse, and we know about the host. But that's about all we know. We don't know the large picture of how these animals and humans traveled. We used to think it was surely on trade routes, but scientific data as to the dissemination patterns don't support this as the early mechanism. Later, trade definitely caused the Black Death to move, but in the beginning, it was more likely something else. What we know is that plague eventually would extend across the entirety of Eurasia, move into sub-Saharan Africa, and the Islamic world of the time. Later, it would be transferred all the way to Australia and later to the Americas. The traditional story of the disease is that it spread in the 14th century very quickly from the Black Sea, to the Black Sea from China. We get the story of the Mongol horde who is inside Kaffa, outside Kaffa, seizing the Genoese merchants in the city and throwing the bodies over the walls to poison them with plague. The source is not eyewitness, and it's somewhat suspect. it probably happened a little bit further up the Black Sea, where the plague originated. We also know that the plague got to China in 1218, over 100 years earlier than when these accounts are happening. It was probably taken there by the Mongols. What probably happened sometime around 1200 is the disease mutated. There's a big bang of plague, which creates a polytype of Yersinia pestis when it broke into different branches. The one circled is the Black Death. All of the major branches are similar enough to know that there was one strain that broke. And this leads to what's known as the second wave of plague, which is the Black Death time. Most likely it happened in the Tian Shan Mountains on the border of Kyrgyzstan and China. There isn't a major breakout in the 13th century, although the light blue shows how it went to China in the 13th century, probably because of climate. The Little Ice Age hadn't happened yet and did not set the stage in the same way it would in the 14th century. What we do know is that in the 14th century, it travels out of the Black Sea, first to Constantinople, and arrives in Sicily and then Italy in 1347. It will quickly spread to the rest of Europe. And this map has a rough timeline. It travels first to Western Europe and Islamic Spain, and then to Northern and Eastern Europe. What we know is that virtually no part of Eurasia was untouched, including the Islamic world, the Jewish world, the Christian world, the Buddhist world. All of it happened. It spreads quickly because of the urbanization and commercialization that I talked about. And cities feel it most acute because of dense population and the rat population, frankly. By 1353, most of it has worked its way out of Western Europe. It ran its course. But what are the effects? Well, when nearly half the population of Europe dies, there's going to be effects in Europe. One of the things we see is utter and complete chaos as shops and businesses close. We see chaos in the works of Boccaccio, the great Decameron, who describes Florence during the plague. We also see in the work of Ibn al-Wardi that plague in Aleppo was at least as deadly as it was in Florence, if not worse. Rich people will flee, or wealthy people will flee the cities to try and avoid it. And that's what Boccaccio is writing about in the Decameron. He takes these 5 women and 5 men, has them flee the city up to their villa, and basically party and tell dirty stories until the plague goes away. They were able to get out, and people who were able to get out survived. It hit the poor disproportionately than it did the wealthy. There were, in addition, there were not enough people left to bury all the bodies and not enough cemetery space to bury them in. Church bells are stopped from ringing at funerals because they thought it was bad for morale. It changes Christian funerary practices. New ways of burial, new ways of cremation come into existence that hadn't happened before. Very quickly, we also see quarantines in the major cities. One example actually happens in Bergen in Scandinavia, what is now Norway, but Scandinavia at the time. A wool ship drifted into the harbor as if nobody was at the rudder. When someone went out to check, every single member of that boat, of that crew, was dead. So to quarantine that ship, they burned it in the harbor. Bodies, wool, ship together. People reacted by persecuting people they blamed. They scapegoated the Jews. Jews died, particularly in Germany. I know that's surprising that there would be a German persecution of Jews, but it happened. They believed that Jews were poisoning the wells. It should be noted that Jews died at nearly the exact same rate as Christians did. There's this weird thing that the Jews in Poland aren't persecuted, mostly because the Poles accepted them as taxpayers. which is one of the reasons there's such a high population of Jews in Poland leading into the Second World War in the 20th century. Lepers, who used to be a source of Christian charity, ended up being persecuted as well for poisoning the wells and somehow poisoning the air. Apparently lepers can poison the air. I never knew of this. The response, not surprisingly for the Middle Ages, was oftentimes religious. There was an eschatological view that came up that the world was ending. Anti-clericalism developed. Lots and lots of churchmen died between the Mendicant Franciscans and Dominicans, between monks and between priests, mostly because they were the ones in the city who were catering to the sick. That was part of their job. And they naturally got it and died. They were the frontline workers of the Black Death. We also get these guys, the flagellants. These guys went from town to town beating themselves to forgive the collective sins of the people. They became a problem because, well, when you have open sores in a time of disease, that isn't great for disease prevention. And also the church saw them as a problem because the church wanted to control who could forgive sins and who could not. The religious response is beautiful. You get the Danse Macabre, which is this idea of death dancing amongst the living. The skeletons poke fun at the living as if to say, you will be here soon. Intellectual history is affected. Not many academics died, mostly because they were wealthy and could go to the countrysides outside of Paris and Oxford and Cambridge and Prague. But there are accounts of academics saying, you know what, I was okay, but actually I got a better job because the person who held the academic position died in the plague, which is, I can't ever believe that an academic would do that, but they did. Following 1353, there's actually a fairly quick return to normalcy. There's actually what some scholars have called the golden age of the wage laborer, supply and demand. There's still land to farm. People died, so there's less supply of labor, so they could demand higher wages. These will lead to peasant revolts in England and France. It is also possible that it is really the end of the Middle Ages. We usually teach the Middle Ages to 1500, but in reality, the world was completely different after 1355. The great humanist thinker Petrarch remarked about the plague. And the end of the quote is, our forefathers have also deserved them, and may our posterity not also merit the same. These are divine punishments. Petrarch is one of the first great humanists. People like Machiavelli, people like Petrarch, Batista, Da Vinci, all of these people will look back at the Black Death. The Black Death changes how people look at life and death. It leads to humanistic thought, which is a search for a better way to live. And I would argue, as many do, that humanistic thought is the most important development of the early modern period, leading to Reformation, liberalism, nationalism, and the like. And I'm using those words in the context of 17th and 18th century, not modern connotations of them. So what's new in plague studies? Well, one is that we're breaking out of a Eurocentric approach to plague studies. More people are looking at what it did in China, in Africa, and beyond. I'm sorry that I probably failed a little bit at doing that today, but I wanted to be quick and I figured more people were interested in the European aspect, but I can definitely talk more about the more global perspective. The role of the Mongols has been questioned in disease transmission. Did they play a bigger role than merchants? How did the two go? Death tolls have been adjusted. 100 years ago, 100 years ago, people said that 25% of the population died. That's not nearly enough. New studies of cemeteries, of texts, indicate that as much as 50% of Eurasia died. At least 50 million people died. In some areas, as much as 60% of the population died. We're able to now show that 80 to 90% of strains of Yersinia pestis that developed after the Big Bang of the 13th and 14th century, and hence our modern strains are nearly identical to the 14th century variety. And that allows us to trace it better, which means we can see the Black Death not as an isolated phenomenon a 5-year crisis, but the beginning of a long shared trauma, closely tied to the Little Ice Age that affected both the old and the new worlds. So what about the new world? What about the modern time? It's still here. This article is from earlier in July. It's from the Denver Post. If you keep reading, the prairie dogs have it. First case since 2015. 5 years for a case of Black Death seems pretty close to me, but they were pretty happy about it. I did my master's at the University of Colorado, and it was always fun to teach the plague and point to the prairie dogs out the window. Usually what happens is somebody's cat gets too close to the prairie dog and somebody gets plague and goes and gets antibiotics and everything is fine. One of the interesting sort of combinations of the plague, of the Black Death and the modern crisis, is that in Florence, there are these wine windows. And I'd like to thank Max Rondolino for bringing this to my attention, that in the plague, they had these windows where people would open the window, they'd send the glass of wine out on a pallet, you'd put your money on it and they'd put it in and close it. They were the drive-throughs, they were the curbside pickup of the plague. And these are actually reopening in Florence as a result of COVID-19. So the legacy of the Black Death is living on. What else can we say in the modern day? We are arguably living in a world of crises. The last 50 years has witnessed unprecedented population growth in the world. We have war. As Tim Crane pointed out a couple of weeks ago in his talk on the Spanish flu, the 20th century was probably the most violent in world history. And that continues into the 21st. Globalization is at a height. There's no way to deny it. We can get information from around the world and goods from around the world quickly. My daughter's just got a sweatshirt from some YouTuber they like that was shipped from China in a matter of days. And climate change. Climate matters. And we're at an interesting point, because we saw the relationship between climate fluctuations and reintroductions of the plague between 1350 and 1900. There was a relationship. Our response to COVID will tell us a lot about our continued responses to the climate crises. It's there. There's a lot of articles on how our response to COVID should be environmentally conscious and whether those responses are going to hurt or help the environment. So I think it's safe to say that we are in a world of crises. And yet, the word crises only came to mean one of these moments of panic, one of these moments of damage in the 17th century. Before that, it came from a Greek word, crisis. The word crisis means decision. And I guess in light of the Black Death, in light of the Antonine Plague and the Justinian Plague, in light of Pericles and the Peloponnesian War, I ask, as we face our crises, our decisions, which ones are we going to make in light of the environment and pandemics? Thank you very much.
Great. We've got a few questions in the chat already, so I'll get started.